Ah, crap, I forgot to write an intro bit. Screw it. It's the end of the year. Let's just fast forward and get to the good stuff. Hey everyone, welcome to episode 308 of Waiting in the Sky with TJ Starman. This is the last episode of 2022. Really quick before I get into today's episode, if you missed it, episode 307 is a really fun one. I was joined by Daryl Edge, who is the host of the Cage Rage podcast. Now, this is a podcast in which he has covered 100, and that's not an exaggeration, 100 Nicolas Cage movies. We got to talk about the National Treasure franchise in honor of the new Disney Plus series, including speculation of a Nicolas Cage return for a new National Treasure sequel. So, if you missed that one, it's definitely worth going back to and checking that out, and I definitely recommend checking out the Cage Rage podcast as well. Like I said, 100 episodes, each covering a Nicolas Cage movie. How can you argue that? You may have already noticed this is a shorter episode of the podcast, and the reason for that is honestly just because things get a little crazy this time of year. Fortunately, I was able to record a couple of episodes in advance and sort of anticipate things running down to the wire here in 2022, like they do in every year as you get down to the end of the year. You get into the holiday season, things get a little colder, got to work around travel plans, just kind of general stress and things like that, both for myself and for potential guests that I'm looking to line up. So wasn't able to make the stars align, so to speak, and get a really exciting episode here to close things out, but I decided to just roll with it. I still wanted to put an episode out to end the season and really to just kind of wrap things up for the podcast in the year 2022. So you're going to get a lot of me, and I hope that's all right. If you're listening to this podcast, hopefully you are okay with my voice because it is on every episode. If you've listened to more than one episode and you don't like my voice, I would love to hear from you because that just seems crazy. But I am already getting into the dangers of solo podcasting right now, and that is just kind of rambling on with no real goal in sight. So let me shift things a little bit and sort of break down what I'm going for with this episode. The idea I had as we are wrapping up the year 2022 is, what is everyone's favorite part? What's one of the most exciting parts of New Year's Eve? Because this episode is dropping, I believe, on the 29th of December. So, plenty of time to plan. You make your plans for New Year's Eve. But sort of in that spirit, I wanted to create a countdown of some sort. And ultimately, I settled on creating a countdown in movies. Now, what do I mean by that? I'm not going to give you a ranking necessarily. I am going to give you a countdown of movies that have numbers in their titles. So, the question is, where exactly do you start this countdown? And, I thought it made sense to start the countdown at 10, which is really where things sort of pick up at the end of New Year's and everyone starts getting excited for the ball to drop, fireworks to go off, and all of those fun, exciting things that come with a New Year's Eve celebration. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start with number 10, and I'm going to go through down to number 1 and share a movie with that number in its title. And I just want to talk to you a little bit about that movie. It's like I said, there's no rankings here. The reason that I chose these specific movies, it ranges. It could have been, just the title jumped off the webpage as I was looking on Wikipedia. It could have been just a no-brainer that I needed to go with this particular movie. It could be one that I've seen many, many times and it's one of my favorites and I want to talk about it. It could just be one movie that I saw one time and realized I hadn't really thought about since. So there's a lot of different reasons I have chosen these 10 particular movies. And I'm really excited to get into it and just kind of share a little bit about each one. I'm not going to go too in depth with it. I really just wanted this to be a sort of short and sweet episode here. Like I said, I'm talking by myself and I really don't want to ramble too much. So if you are watching on YouTube, I'm going to try and get some really pretty visuals, maybe throw in some clips from the movies in there as well, just sort of running while I'm talking. something I want to do more of in general, but it's not something I've done too much of to this point. So if you are a podcast listener exclusively, you're probably not missing out too much as far as the episodes go. But definitely check out the YouTube channel for the exclusive YouTube content like the Pokemon Challenge videos. But hey, there's plenty of movies that have numbers in their titles. So I want to give a couple of special mentions, sort of honorable mentions here to kick things off before I get into my countdown, starting with number 10. Just movies that have a number in their title that I could have started with. And looking back at number 60. So let's say I were to start this countdown at 60 seconds, so a full minute. Getting things rolling at 11:59. Gone in 60 seconds. We're just keeping that Nicolas Cage train rolling here. He's been a pretty popular name here on the podcast in the year 2022. So let's keep that going. Gone in 60 Seconds is a super fun movie. Of course, I already mentioned Nicolas Cage, so I'm referring specifically to the Gone in 60 Seconds 2000 movie, which is a remake of a 1974 film. But yeah, no, Nicolas Cage starring alongside Angelina Jolie. Angelina Jolie is blonde in this one, is one of the biggest things I remember, I guess. It's all about Nicolas Cage being this sort of badass car thief who has to steal, I believe, 60 cars in order to get his brother out of a big bunch of trouble that was ultimately going to end in his death. So super fun one if you haven't seen it. It's one of those it's like a TNT movie. Back when everyone had cable and you were just kind of channel surfing, it would be on TNT and you kind of stop and watch. That's the best way I could describe Gone in 60 Seconds if you're not familiar. Of course, 50 First Dates would be a great candidate if I were to go that far with this countdown. Adam Sandler, if you somehow managed to listen to the first 3 episodes I ever did of this podcast, they were all based on Adam Sandler and breaking down the 3 different eras of Adam Sandler, the way that I see it. And so 50 First Dates is one of his best films, in my opinion. I won't spoil those episodes in case you are listening to this and you haven't checked those out yet. You might enjoy it. I don't think I knew what I was doing at that time, but I still had some fun creating those episodes and talking about Adam Sandler movies. 50 First Dates, it's all about Adam Sandler being in Hawaii. Drew Barrymore plays his love interest who has short-term memory loss, and so it's all about navigating that sort of tricky situation where they are falling in love multiple times, and how do we resolve this? They kind of resolve it in the end. I talk about one of my biggest issues with that movie in that early podcast episode as well. We're just keeping it going by tens here. The 40-Year-Old Virgin is pretty funny. I don't know how well the humor holds up in 2022, now 2023. Probably not super well, but it is, Steve Carell, Seth Rogen, you get Paul Rudd in there, the whole Judd Apatow crew. But there was some good laughs to be had, at least when it originally came out. Like I said, I don't know how well the comedy is going to hold up in the modern era, but it's one that I remember fondly and would probably check out again at some point. Again, maybe that's one if it happens to be on somewhere that I'd watch it, but maybe I won't actively seek it out. Who knows? 13 going on 30, kind of a twofer. I could put that one in at 13 or 30. In this case, that's kind of where I'm slotting it in. Super underrated movie. I think it's a lot of fun. It doesn't make a lick of sense whatsoever, but you get Jennifer Garner playing a young girl who just wants to be an adult and grow up, and sort of you get I don't know, it's kind of big plus, it's probably big and It's a Wonderful Life, I guess, where she just wants to jump forward in her life and she kind of sees what her life is like and realizes that she missed out on a lot of things in those 17 years between age 13 and age 30. The number 23. Yep. All right. So 21 and 22 Jump Street. Those are surprisingly fun movies featuring Channing Tatum and Jonah Hill. It was a reboot of the old, I believe it's an 80s series. And it was fun. They took this in a modern direction. The action's pretty cool, but the comedic chemistry between the two leads, I think, is what sets it apart. You get Ice Cube in there as well, bringing his flavor to it. Those are a lot of fun. So if you missed those, again, that's one I'd recommend for sure. Jump ahead a little bit further here. 16 Candles, classic. Obviously the Brat Pack, all of that type of crew, that flavor, Molly Ringwald, all of that. It would be talked about more if it wasn't 16. I think you ruined the whole movie if it was a different number of candles, I guess. 13 going on 30 again. Like I said, you could totally flip that either at 13 or at 30. Something else you could slot in at 13 would be Ocean's 13. Briefly entertained just starting with Ocean's 13 for the heck of it, with the actual countdown here. But Ocean's 12, Ocean's 11, I really like those movies. The trilogy there, the George Clooney, Brad Pitt ones, that obviously are a remake of the original. And I think they're just fun. I think that was what really got me into heist movies. In general, I think that they have this really fun style to them where you learn some things before like the mark does, but you also don't learn everything. And a lot is revealed to you, after the fact, rather than while they're in the planning stages. You see only certain things, and I think that's what adds to a lot of the fun there. And obviously the cast is just outrageous. They work really well off each other. I think of Casey Affleck and Scott Conn. Of course, Brad Pitt, George Clooney, Julia Roberts, Matt Damon. They stand out. Bernie Mac, Don Cheadle. Like, you can really just start listing people off and just keep going for an entire podcast episode. So I'll try to avoid that trap right now. And that's going to bring us to our official 10 film countdown here, starting with the number 10. And for this entry, I chose 10 Things I Hate About You. 10 Things I Hate About You is a 1999 film directed by Gil Junger, and starring Heath Ledger and Julia Stiles. This is peak Julia Stiles. This was, the quintessential moment for her, I feel like. And I think Heath Ledger really shines in this as well. But if you're not familiar with this movie, it is actually an adaptation of Shakespeare, specifically The Taming of the Shrew. And the sort of general setup here is that Julia Stiles' character, Kat, is the more reserved, more like doing her own thing, independent, older sister to totally blanking on what her sister's character's name is, an actress, and her sister is the more outgoing, more social, more like romantically interested of the two. And so she wants to start dating and she wants to get involved with her boyfriend. And the issue that she runs into is their father is sort of using Julia Stiles' character as a scapegoat here, saying like, well, if your sister isn't dating anyone, like, you're not old enough, you're not ready to be dating anyone either. And so the whole concept of this movie is that the sister's boyfriend is trying to get Heath Ledger's character, who's sort of this like rebellious bad boy, to take Julia Stiles' character out and go to the dance with her so that he can officially start dating the younger sister. And that's basically the whole setup for it. But what I like is that you get a lot of the sort of high school, caricatures or sort of, thematic elements of high school movies within this one that make it fun. I think every time you get a high school movie, you sort of get a time capsule of that specific time and place in that era. And I think 1999 is a very interesting time and place. This is sort of like right around, I guess, the American Pie sort of time frame as well, but before we get into like a newer era, I guess like a literal step before Mean Girls. So I think there's a lot of really fun pieces to this movie, and the fact that it is adapted from Shakespeare's work is a fun little anecdote as well. And I think it still holds up. It's one I've actually watched earlier this year, and a lot of fun. If you somehow missed 10 Things I Hate About You, check it out. This one made the list because it's one I haven't watched a whole lot, but definitely one that I've enjoyed. Next up, for entry number 9, District 9. District 9 is a 2009 film, fittingly enough, released by director Neil Blomkamp, who is definitely known for his own signature style. If you're familiar with Chappie, you could very easily tell that Neil Blomkamp was the creator of both. I also believe Peter Jackson was a producer on this film as well. Very well-known name, Lord of the Rings, among many other things. But District 9 is interesting. It's sort of a space story, but not really. It kind of centers around this alien species that lands on Earth and then is basically contained and forced to live in essentially a ghetto, and just very poor living conditions, set up by the governments of Earth, because they're not sure exactly can this alien species be trusted to just live alongside us. And so they just kind of herd them all into this one place. And it's about I believe a reporter or maybe some sort of agent with a government agency, is sort of investigating and looking more into what's actually happening here in District 9, and interacting with its residents, and I believe ends up getting infected with some sort of infection. It's actually been a while since I've watched this one, and this is basically here because it jumped out to me as a reminder of a movie that I should probably go back and check out at some point, because I remember it being pretty interesting. But an action movie, definitely some sci-fi elements to it. Keeps you guessing a little bit. There's a lot of twists and turns from what I can recall. One that I'm gonna go back and watch now that I've talked about it at its very base level. And I'd love to hear what you all think about District 9 as well, because I actually haven't watched Chappie. Maybe I've caught some of it, but really the reason I remember Chappie at all is just because every time I see the poster, it makes me think at first that it's District 9, and District 9 was just much more memorable to me than anything that I know about Chappie. Next up is entry number 8. And before I get into it, I just want to ask you, if you had one shot, one opportunity, and that's where I'm going to bow out. So yeah, number 8, I had to go with 8 Mile. If you're not familiar with 8 Mile, it is sort of, I believe, semi-autobiographical story about Eminem's rise from Detroit to not entirely being a star rapper, but sort of what his life was like as a rapper, trying to reach new heights and be discovered from this sort of underground scene. And it really dives into life in Detroit, which I think there's a lot of movies that depict what life in Detroit is like. And this is one that I maybe take a little bit more at face value because it's coming from Eminem, and so much of it is tied to his own story. But again, he plays B-Rabbit, is the rapper character in this movie. He's a battle rapper underground. He's got this crew of friends that are pretty tight with him, and it just kind of goes through the struggles that he faces. Trying to make a name for himself. Trying to scrape together cash just to make a decent living, take care of his family. Obviously, a lot of his music talks about his mother and his daughters and stuff like that. And I think a lot of that makes its way into the movie in some way, shape, or form to kind of just paint this picture overall of what it's like. And of course, you get Lose Yourself from the soundtrack, and the cast is pretty solid as well. Eminem himself does pretty well in the starring role. He is not going to get confused for like a legitimate actor, really, but does well enough in this role, and obviously knows himself. Kim Basinger, you get Brittany Murphy here, Mekhi Phifer, a lot of other recognizable faces too as you watch it. But 8 Mile is going to make this list for our countdown at number 8. At number 7, I mean, this is a pretty obvious one. I felt like of this whole list, this is one of the most obvious to include here, and that is Seven, which has probably the worst stylized title I have ever seen. It's technically SE7EN, whereas they don't even use that on like the poster here. I'm looking at its IMDb page right now, and it's just the word 7. So I don't understand why they stylized this. The 7, I guess, has an angle. The V has an angle, but they don't turn like the 7 to make it look like a V or anything like that. So I don't know. That's just one of my biggest pet peeves with this movie. But really, you have to nitpick to find something that really pisses you off that much about this movie, because it's a good one. So from director David Fincher, it's 1995, starring Morgan Freeman, Brad Pitt, and also plays a bad guy. He's a natural at that, it turns out. And for this one, I'm not going to talk too much about it, in all honesty, because either you are familiar with this movie and you understand the concept of it and you probably really liked it, or you may very strongly dislike it. Either way, I'm not going to affect your opinion of it. Or you haven't seen this movie, in which case I don't really want to paint your view on it too much before you actually go and see it for yourself. So Seven came out in 1995. This is like, David Fincher, if you're not familiar, also the director of Fight Club. So you get that team up with Brad Pitt. If you liked Fight Club, David Fincher just has his own sort of unique view on movies. And I'm not going to say that those movies are, very similar, because I think there is still a very, solid distinction between, this movie, which is a detective drama and mystery thriller, I guess, and, Fight Club, which is much more, action oriented and stylized. But like I said, don't want to talk too much about Seven. I'll give you the base if you somehow haven't seen this one. Like I said, it's a detective story. Features Brad Pitt as a younger detective and Morgan Freeman, who is an older veteran of the detective game. And they are on the hunt for a serial killer who has been using the 7 deadly sins as his motives. So that's basically the setup for it. The 7 deadly sins, if you're not familiar, sloth, envy, lust, like all of those types of things. I highly recommend it. Definitely check it out. Just realized that I actually gave a big spoiler, so I'm going to cut that out, and we're going to move on to the next entry here. This seems like kind of a natural progression here. If you were to actually watch these movies, then I feel like this would make a lot of sense to go from 7 to our entry for number 6, and that is going to be The Sixth Sense. Also, shout out to 50 First Dates again, because the movie makes a cameo. The movie itself makes a cameo in 50 First Dates. But, I'm sure everyone has at least heard of The Sixth Sense from M. Night Shyamalan, sort of the movie that made his name, obviously known for interesting twists in the films that sort of reveal themselves at the end and kind of paint the rest of the movie in a whole different light. This movie sort of, made that his calling card. And I'm sure everyone has seen it. Even if you haven't seen it, I'm sure the famous quotes from it, or you've known what the twist itself is here. This movie starring Bruce Willis, young Haley Joel Osment. I believe this was Haley Joel Osment's big breakthrough. I think he may have been in other movies previously, but sort of the role that put his name and face on the map. But it's all about a young boy who claims to be able to communicate with the spirits of the dead. And so it's Haley Joel Osment's character reaching out to Bruce Willis for help and assistance, I guess, throughout the movie. And yeah, what more can I say about The Sixth Sense without totally, breaking it apart? Not tearing it apart. It's a good movie, but breaking it apart into pieces, which this different time and place for that. And, I talked about sort of the tonal consistency of Seven and The Sixth Sense. This is where you totally break from that at number 5 here, as I go with a romantic comedy of all things, and that is The 5-Year Engagement. This is 2012, directed by Nicholas Stoller, starring Jason Segel and Emily Blunt, and an early role, Chris Pratt. So very interesting. This movie is one that I feel like kind of goes under the radar compared to a lot of the other, the Judd Apatow sort of Jason Segel and that crew collection of comedies that came out in late 2000s, early 2010s. And this one maybe just didn't make enough of a name for itself or set itself apart. It does feel much more on the romantic comedy side of things than just like those sort of dumb comedies that a lot of the Judd Apatow stuff is. But I like it. I think there's a lot of charm to it. I think a lot of that comes from the cast itself. This is before I think everyone was tired of Chris Pratt because he hadn't been in everything and Stompin' Koopas and that type of thing just yet. And Jason Segel, if you watch How I Met Your Mother, I'm a big fan of that show. He does have a lot of charm in sort of the straight man role. And alongside Emily Blunt, I think they did have some good chemistry on screen. And the title says it all here. It's about a young couple that get engaged. And then as they're starting to progress towards their marriage, one thing pops up, another thing pops up. Their life just starts taking, different turns and twists, and essentially just causes the wedding to get pushed further and further down the line to the point where they've eventually, had a 5-year engagement. And, that's the whole basis of the story there. I think, like I said, I think this is a lot of fun. It's one that I probably haven't watched a ton, but I've always enjoyed when I have watched it. You're going to see some other familiar faces in this one as well. Alison Brie, Dakota Johnson is on here as well, and maybe some other faces you won't know the names of, but just another one to maybe take note of if you're looking to check out a couple of movies with numbers in the title, if you are also looking for this very specific curated list. When I talked about Gone in 60 Seconds earlier, I referred to it as a TNT movie, a cable TNT movie. And I think our entry number 4 definitely fits that bill as well, because that's Four Brothers. So this is a 2005 film. It is sort of I guess you could call it a family crime drama. But the whole concept with this one is that it's 4 adopted brothers that return to their home after their adopted mother is killed in a store burglary. And so they come obviously to pay their respects, but also to investigate and figure out exactly what happened here. Was there more to it than just this robbery that she got caught in? There's a lot of organized crime in their hometown. So this is a fun one because you get interesting leading characters here. So the director is John Singleton. The stars Mark Wahlberg, Tyrese Gibson, Andre 3000, and then Garrett Hedlund play the titular Four Brothers. But you're also going to get Terrence Howard, Chiwetel Ejiofor, Taraji P. Henson, a lot of pretty well established actors in this movie, and I think really helped to flesh out the storyline. And I think it's just a fun look at like family dynamics of they're sort of thrown together as adoptive brothers and adopted family, but there's still this sense of loyalty between them. But there's also they have a history with each other. They have a history with this town and the people that live in it. And it also kind of gives me like a sort of a Sons of Anarchy vibe. If you ever watch that show and you're looking for maybe some sort of point of comparison here, that's probably what I would say. That there is a sort of like grittiness and this sort of, just the crime in this hometown and the sense of belonging that they have, and so much so that they don't fear, going and creating a ruckus so much. It's just a very interesting tone to it. And like I said, seems more like the quintessential TNT movie that I would get hooked on if I happened to pass it channel surfing back in the day. And number 3 is a movie that I put on here, one, because, surprisingly, there wasn't a whole lot of options that I found with the number 3 in the title that really jumped out at me. So I ended up going with a movie that I believe I've only seen one time, but I do remember really enjoying it and really, finding it to be really well done. And that is 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri. So this movie is, I believe this made it really high up in the Oscars voting. May have actually had some winners come from it. I don't follow the Oscars too closely, but I do remember at the time that I watched this, they definitely were nominated for a handful of different awards, I believe, including Best Picture. But the setup for this one is essentially a small town in Missouri, and a mother pays for advertising on a few billboards leading into the town, and just puts messages on them, essentially challenging the police chief of the town about why they've been unable to solve her daughter's murder. And that's the setup of it. But it's just the constant back and forth, the pressuring from this mother on this police department, the police chief, to, figure things out, to make some actual, visible progress and strides in, solving this very personal case, obviously to her. And I think that just the performances in this film were really what set it apart. So Frances McDormand plays the mother and does an absolutely great job of just, giving you this, like I said, I think just the pressure that she's exhibiting on the police, and specifically the police chief, Woody Harrelson here, is just, it's palpable. You really feel it coming through the screen, as I can recall. I really feel like that's the lasting memory I have of watching this movie back in 2017 when it was released. And Woody Harrelson, I think, does a good job as well. I like him in a lot of the different stuff that he does. Sam Rockwell was in this, and I think it's sort of like this. He's been good for a long time, but I think he sort of hit a really high point right around this time as well. And so I think he adds to this cast. You got a young Lucas Hedges, who is sort of come into his own more recently. Caleb Landry Jones as well, sort of on that same trajectory there. And even Peter Dinklage having a role in this movie as well. So I don't have a whole lot to say about it because, like I said, it's been since 2017 when I last watched it for the first and only time. But one that I may actually go back and revisit now that I sort of had my memory refreshed. All right, so we're down to number 2. And one thing I don't want to do here is I don't want to get too carried away. But I can go too fast, too furious. So yeah, obviously, I had to pick Too Fast, Too Furious. There are 2 twos in the title. And I love this franchise. It is one of the stupidest things you could ever watch. But, oh man, do I love it so much. I love it so much. And this is, you could guess, the second entry in the franchise. And this is, believe it or not, before the numbering and the titling of these movies gets really crazy. So 2003, Too Fast, Too Furious is coming in off the heels of, I believe, 2000s, The Fast and the Furious, which in it of itself is a reinterpretation of Point Break. It's about Brian O'Connor, played by Paul Walker, who is sort of continuing his story now that he had his experience with Dominic Toretto in the first movie. That's Vin Diesel's character. And so he gets called in to essentially go undercover in, I believe, Miami to help bust I think he's a drug kingpin or something. Just like this big Miami crime lord guy. So I just assume it's probably cocaine, but maybe that's the default Scarface type of thing. And this one's just fun. I think they really narrowed, zoomed in on what made the first movie fun and successful, and that was just, the dumb driving action that people have really latched onto over the years, and they doubled down on it. They Too Fast, Too Furious. It's a perfect name. I mean, it's a really stupid name, but it's also a perfect name. You know what I mean? So you get Paul Walker. He finds backup in his childhood friend, Roman Pierce. And so this is where we get the introduction of Tyrese Gibson's character into this franchise. You also get Eva Mendes as this movie's one-off love interest. You get the debut of Ludacris's character, Tez, in this movie as well. So, Roman and Tez are like the two long-term lasting elements from what this movie does, including Paul Walker's Brian O'Connor. But obviously he was already in the first movie. So they're the more lasting legacy of Too Fast, Too Furious. And looking back at this one now, it's definitely still part of that very grounded era of Fast and Furious, if you can't even imagine what that was like. So things don't get totally off the rails just yet here, either in name or in the actual content of the movie. And finally, we are down to entry number 1 here. And I couldn't tell you really why I chose this one, besides the fact that I guess it's just one of my sincere guilty pleasure movies. And that is 2009's Year One. So this movie is very, very stupid, but it hit me at the absolute right time because this is Michael Cera, fresh off of Superbad. It's Jack Black, a couple years removed from like School of Rock, around the Tenacious D, Pick of Destiny era. So you're kind of getting those two guys as your leading stars in a movie that's about cavemen sort of meandering through history in different eras of history, obviously going from being cavemen living in a tribe to being in like the Roman Empire, and it's like I said, very, very dumb, but it's like this cross-country road trip movie, and just the stupid comedy really hit me at the right time. This was probably like a freshman in high school when this came out, freshman, sophomore. So a lot of like really dumb quotes still kind of stick in my mind to this day. It's not one I could totally recommend to anyone. Like I said, this is definitely a guilty pleasure movie for me. It's not one that I'm like, oh, everyone's sleeping on this movie, it's great. Because no, I couldn't earnestly say that. But this is very stupid. If you ever want to watch a really stupid movie and you're looking for one that you haven't seen yet, and it does have some decent, cheap laughs here and there, Year One is probably one to check out. But that's pretty much the only circumstances in which I would recommend someone watching this who hasn't actually seen it yet. The cast is pretty decent. You're gonna see a lot of familiar faces from like comedians. Jack Black, Michael Cera, like I already said, Olivia Wilde, Oliver Platt, David Cross, Christopher Mintz-Plasse, so also coming off of Superbad, Vinnie Jones, Hank Azaria, June Diane Raphael. Like, even if you don't know these names, you're definitely going to recognize the faces. Horatio Sands, very much of this era comedy, dumb comedy. So if that's your thing and you missed this one, check it out. Everyone else, I mean, feel free to steer clear. You're not going to be judged for not having seen year one. In fact, you're all probably busy judging me for having seen it and for taking this much time to talk about it on a podcast. So that's it. If you started this podcast episode at, I'm not going to do the math, but if you started this at some point on New Year's Eve and you cared enough to listen to it, you maybe had a shot at lining up the countdown. I don't know that it's worth that type of legwork, but if you did that, I commend you, honestly. But hey, this was just a lot of fun for me to kind of talk about random movies in a way that made it seem not as random. And so to recap our countdown, we had 10 Things I Hate About You, District 9, 8 Mile, 7, The Sixth Sense, The 5-Year Engagement, Four Brothers, 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri, Too Fast, Too Furious, and Year One. Taking a quick look ahead to wrap up the year here in 2022, I do have a special Pokemon Challenge video planned for YouTube. So if you are a subscriber on YouTube, definitely keep an eye out for that. If you are not yet a subscriber on YouTube, I do recommend it. I am going to try and do a little bit more with video, like I mentioned earlier on, try and, maybe weave in some clips here and there rather than just a static background that I've been doing for podcast episodes. So even if you're not a Pokemon fan, might be worth checking it out. But for that special New Year's Eve Pokemon Challenge video, I did try out a new format, some new things stylistically as well. So I'm curious to see what the reception is like to it, to anyone who has been following those Pokemon Challenge videos. This one will take the place of the Pokemon Sun Electric Types Only Challenge that I'd originally planned for December, but have no fear, that one will still happen. It's just going to come out at the end of January rather than at the end of December here, because I just wanted to do something a little bit more special with a little bit more of a unique style to it, just in honor of New Year's Eve. So doing it as a New Year's Eve special, and like I said, give me a chance to experiment a little bit with the style and format of those videos. As for the podcast, we will pick up again with episode 309. My hope is to still maintain the 2-week schedule here. So as for now, expect no interruption. Really, I'm still expecting 2 weeks from the release of this episode to be able to have episode 309 releasing as well. Thank you so much for listening, not just to this episode or to season 3 as a whole, but to any content that we've put out in 2022 that you've listened to. Just thank you so much. I've really had so much fun in what's been my first full year of content creation. And I was very excited just to be able to share it with you and anyone who has been able to get some enjoyment out of listening to the podcast, watching Pokemon Challenge videos, or anything like that. I wish you all the best in 2023. Thanks for listening to episode 308 of Waiting in the Sky, and I hope you'll stick around for more.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6